Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. The city was alive. It pulsed with the rhythm of 1,000 stories unfolding at once. Cars honking, neon signs flickering, the distant hum of an approaching subway. In the middle of it all, weaving through the chaos with precision, was Nate Carter, a 22-year-old bicycle courier. For Nate, the city wasn't just home, it was his battleground. Every morning, he strapped on his weathered messenger bag, tightened his helmet, and pushed off into the streets, racing against time. The money wasn't great, and the job was brutal, but it kept him moving. That was all that mattered. He had no time for dreams. He had bills to pay. Rent was overdue, his bike was falling apart, and his landlord was already sending not-so-friendly reminders. The dream of doing something more with his life? That felt like a joke. But today was different. As he picked up his first delivery, a package from a high-end law firm, his phone buzzed with a notification. Urgent delivery, high priority. The payout was triple the usual rate. Nate whistled. Low. That wasn't normal. His eyes skimmed the address. Blackwood Tower, 77th floor. That was the kind of place where deals worth millions were made. He glanced at the package in his hands. Plain, unmarked, but heavier than expected. Something about this felt off. But Nate wasn't the type to ask questions. He gripped the handlebars and launched forward. This was just another delivery. Or so he thought. The city seemed to close in around Nate as he pedaled through the streets, his legs pushing harder with each block. The package felt heavier with every turn, but it wasn't just the weight that bothered him. There was a sense of urgency in the air, an unspoken pressure that hummed beneath the usual rhythm of the city. He dodged a cab, narrowly avoiding a collision with a pedestrian who cursed him out as he swerved past. But Nate didn't flinch. He'd been doing this long enough to know that every second mattered. Time was a relentless force, and it only moved faster when you tried to outrun it. As he neared the towering skyscraper of Blackwood Tower, the sheer size of it made him pause for a second. The building loomed above, its glass and steel walls reflecting the dimming light of the late afternoon. A place like this felt like a world apart from his, a world he could never touch. Yet, here he was, about to enter it on a bike, with nothing but the weight of this strange package to guide him. The elevator ride up felt like it took forever. Nate tapped his fingers impatiently against the railing. The building was quiet, almost eerily so, with the hum of the lights overhead the only sound. His heart raced as he reached the 77th floor, and when the doors finally opened, he was greeted by an uncharacteristic silence that made him pause. The receptionist behind the desk didn't even look up when he approached. "I'm here for the delivery," Nate said, trying to sound confident. The woman raised an eyebrow but motioned for him to come closer. "Room 7701, she said curtly, handing him a visitor badge. Nate walked toward the elevator, his mind spinning. Who was the package for? What was so important about it? And why did it feel like the room around him had suddenly gotten colder? With a deep breath, he stepped off the elevator and walked down the long corridor. Something told him that by the end of tonight, his life was going to change forever. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, its sleek, polished floors reflecting the cold, artificial lighting above. Nate's footsteps echoed off the walls as he walked, the weight of the package growing heavier with each step. The door to room 7701 stood at the end of the corridor, imposing and sterile. He stopped in front of it, briefly glancing at the small nameplate that read, Dr. Evelyn Price, Director of Research. Nate's brows furrowed. He'd heard that name before. Dr. Price was a renowned scientist, a genius in the field of genetics and biotechnology. Her research was considered cutting-edge, potentially world-changing. But what did she need with a simple courier like him? He knocked once, then twice, before the door swung open, revealing a tall, slender woman with piercing blue eyes and an expression that seemed to measure him up in an instant. "Are you Nate Carter?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Yeah," he replied, unsure of how to react to her intense gaze. "I've got a delivery for you." Without a word, she stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. Nate hesitated for only a second, before walking in. The room was dimly lit, filled with sleek furniture, glass walls, and an air of quiet efficiency. There were no personal touches, no warmth, just a sterile, professional atmosphere. Dr. Price's desk was covered in papers, but what caught Nate's attention were the two men standing off to the side. They were dressed in black suits, their faces unreadable. Their presence was unsettling, but they didn't seem to care about him at all. They merely watched as he set the package on the table in front of Dr. Price. She didn't immediately acknowledge it. Instead, her eyes remained locked on Nate's face. "I assume you were told the importance of this delivery?" she asked, her tone now sharper, colder. Nate nodded, though his mind was racing. "Yeah. I didn't know it was going to be like this, though." Dr. Price stepped forward and carefully unsealed the package, revealing a small, intricately designed metal box. It was nothing like he had expected. The box was sleek, metallic, almost alien in its design, with a series of strange markings etched along its surface. Nate's eyes widened. What was this thing? The moment Dr. Price touched the box, something inside Nate shifted. A sense of foreboding settled over him, like he had just crossed an invisible line. Dr. Price looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for bringing it here," she said, almost dismissively. "You can leave now." But as Nate turned to leave, he caught the glint of something in the corner of his eye. A small, seemingly innocent device on the desk, humming softly. It wasn't until the elevator doors closed behind him that Nate realized he had just delivered something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and Nate leaned back against the wall, his pulse quickening. What had just happened? He had delivered a package, but the whole encounter felt wrong. The coldness of the office, the way Dr. Price barely acknowledged him, the strange, almost predatory atmosphere. Something didn't add up. He stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby, trying to shake off the unease crawling up his spine. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. A new notification appeared on the screen. "Urgent delivery complete. You have completed your task. Please wait for further instructions." Nate frowned. This wasn't the usual notification he got. Normally, he'd just get paid, and that would be it. But now, this? He glanced around, his eyes darting nervously. Was he being watched? It was probably just paranoia, but in the back of his mind, a small voice told him to be careful. He shook it off and started walking toward the exit. But as he passed the door to the building, a figure stepped out from the shadows. A man in a dark coat, his face hidden beneath a hood. Nate froze, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The man didn't say a word. He just stood there blocking the door. Nate's heart raced. Was this it? Was something about to happen? Was he in trouble? "Hey, is there a problem?" Nate asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The man didn't move. Instead, he simply raised his hand, holding up a small device that Nate instantly recognized. The same humming device he had seen on Dr. Price's desk. Nate's stomach twisted. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, but the man didn't respond. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Nate. "Get away from me!" Nate shouted, his body on full alert. But before he could react, the man quickly pressed a button on the device, and Nate's vision blurred. A sharp, buzzing noise filled his ears, and for a split second, everything went dark. When Nate's vision cleared, he found himself standing in a completely different place. Gone was the cold, sterile lobby. Instead, he was now in a small, dimly lit room, surrounded by strange machinery and a heavy metallic scent in the air. His heart pounded as panic gripped him. Where was he? A voice echoed from the shadows. "You've been chosen, Nate. There's no turning back now." Nate's mind raced, but his body was frozen. The voice from the shadows carried a strange calmness, as if the speaker was used to making others feel small, helpless. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the ground. The room around him was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was cold, industrial, almost like a lab, but much darker, more sinister. The hum of machinery filled the air, echoing against the walls. There were monitors blinking in the corners, showing strange graphs and data he couldn't understand. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping with something he didn't want to identify. Everything felt wrong, as if the space itself was alive, watching him. Another figure emerged from the shadows, this one more familiar. Dr. Evelyn Price. Her calm demeanor from before was replaced with a look of purpose, of cold calculation. She walked toward him, her steps measured, her eyes never leaving his face. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "We're never supposed to be part of this. But now that you are, there's no going back." Nate's heart hammered in his chest. What the hell is going on? Where am I? Dr. Price didn't answer directly. Instead, she motioned to the man with the device. He stepped forward, his face still hidden beneath the hood, and handed her the small, humming object. "We have very specific needs," she said, her voice now laced with something dangerous. "That package you delivered, it wasn't just a delivery. It was a key that could change everything." "Change what?" Nate asked, his voice shaky but defiant. She smirked. "The world, Nate. The world." The man with the device stepped to her side, and for the first time, Nate noticed that he wasn't holding the device anymore. In its place was a small, sleek gun. Nothing like the ones he'd seen in movies, but just as deadly. The weight of it, the realization of what it meant, made Nate's stomach twist. "You don't understand," Dr. Price continued, her tone shifting to something more persuasive, like she was explaining a difficult concept to a child. "You think you're just a courier, just a guy doing a job, taking his pay and moving on. But you've unknowingly been swept into something far bigger. You are now a part of this, whether you want to be or not." Nate's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about a package anymore. This was something more, a mission, a conspiracy, and possibly a dangerous game that he had no idea how to play. I don't want any part of this," he said, trying to step back. But the man with the gun blocked his escape. "You don't get a choice," the man growled. Nate's mind was reeling. How did he get into this? Was there anyone he could trust? What was in the damn box? And why did he feel like he was at the center of something catastrophic? A loud crack echoed through the room, and Nate spun around to see a large door on the opposite side of the room swing open. In walked another person, a younger man, dressed in a lab coat and carrying a clipboard. His presence, oddly out of place in the tense atmosphere, brought a brief moment of relief to Nate. Maybe, just maybe, this was someone who could explain what was happening. But then the young man spoke, and the floor seemed to drop out beneath. "Nate, we're ready to begin," the young man said, his voice betraying no emotion as he approached Dr. Price with an almost rehearsed efficiency. Nate's stomach churned. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a job gone wrong. It was something much darker than he could have ever imagined. And now it seemed like there was no way out. Nate's mind raced as the young man approached Dr. Price, the weight of his words sinking in. "We're ready to begin." What did that mean? Was this some sort of twisted experiment? Was he about to be part of something even worse than a courier mission gone sideways? His heart pounded against his chest as he tried to think of an escape. His options were running thin. The door was behind him, but the man with the gun stood between him and freedom. The only thing he had was his wits, and maybe, just maybe, the element of surprise. Dr. Price didn't acknowledge him any further. She simply nodded at the young man, who began to adjust something on one of the nearby machines. The low hum of the room shifted in pitch as the machinery powered up. The walls around them seemed to pulse with energy, and the monitors flickered to life, displaying complex data that Nate couldn't decipher. Nate's gaze flicked between Dr. Price, the gunman, and the strange machines. Every part of him screamed to run, but where could he go? He didn't even know where he was, let alone how to navigate this maze of steel and glass. "You're probably wondering what this is all about," Dr. Price said, her voice suddenly soft but laden with authority. "What you're caught in, what you're a part of." Nate didn't say anything. He wasn't sure he could speak without his voice cracking. He couldn't believe he was in this situation. Just hours ago, he had been riding his bike through the bustling streets, delivering a simple package. Now, he was trapped in a hidden cold lab, surrounded by people who seemed more like shadows than humans, all of them holding pieces to a puzzle. He didn't understand. Dr. Price's voice cut through the air again, as though she were reading his thoughts. "You're here because of your delivery, Nate. That package wasn't just a set of documents. It was a key. A key to the future. A future where we can manipulate not just biology, but time itself. Nate felt his stomach lurch. Time. Was she insane? You've heard of cryogenics, haven't you? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. Freezing time. Freezing people. But that's just the beginning. What we have here is far more advanced. What you delivered isn't just a box. It's a mechanism that can distort time. Reverse it. Accelerate it. Control it. The weight of her words sank in slowly. But when it did, it hit like a freight train. Nate couldn't process it all at once. Time manipulation. This was absurd. He'd been a courier for years, delivering packages without question. But this was on a completely different level. The young man with the clipboard stepped forward, placing the device down on the table next to Dr. Price. "It's ready," he said, his tone flat, mechanical. Dr. Price's eyes gleamed with an unsettling excitement as she approached the device. The room fell into an eerie silence, the machinery humming in the background like a slow drumbeat. "This is where you come in, Nate," Dr. Price said, her gaze locking onto his, her voice low and almost tender, as if trying to convince him of something. "You were chosen for this because you have a very specific set of qualities. Your adaptability, your resilience. You may not think it, but you're the perfect candidate for what we need." Nate shook his head, disbelief and panic starting to bubble to the surface. "I don't want anything to do with this," he said, his voice hoarse, trembling. But Dr. Price just smiled, as though she knew exactly how to handle his fear. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You already are, Nate. The moment you took that job, you became a part of something far bigger than yourself. You're already involved in this, whether you accept it or not." The young man beside her pressed a button on the device, and a low whirring sound filled the room. Nate's eyes darted from Dr. Price to the machine, watching the lights flicker to life. "You'll have a choice soon," she said softly. "Stay with us. Help us unlock the true potential of time, or walk away, if you can." Nate's mind was a blur of thoughts, fear, and anger. But in the pit of his stomach, something else was growing. He wasn't just a pawn in this twisted game. He wasn't going to let them control him. If he could somehow get out of here, if he could just make it out, he might be able to stop whatever this was before it spiraled any further. But there was no way out now. Not unless he fought back. Nate's mind buzzed with 1,000 different thoughts, all racing too fast for him to process. His chest tightened as the realization sank in. He was trapped. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, and the air felt thick with tension, the humming of the machinery almost suffocating. There was no easy way out. Dr. Price's words hung in the air like a dark omen. "You're already involved in this, whether you accept it or not." His eyes flicked between her and the man with the gun, the device on the table, and the cold, emotionless young man holding the clipboard. They were all a part of something far beyond him, a world where he had no control. He had delivered the package, but now it seemed like the package had delivered him into their grasp. But something stirred inside him, a spark of defiance. He wasn't going to just sit here and let them use him. He didn't care what they were planning or how advanced their technology was. He wasn't a pawn. He had to find a way out. The device on the table continued to hum, its lights flickering erratically, as if responding to some unseen force. Dr. Price stood beside it, her hand hovering over a set of buttons, ready to engage. "We've spent years trying to perfect this," she said, her voice reverberating in the stillness of the room. "And now, it's finally ready. Time manipulation, Nate. You can't even imagine what we can do with it." Nate's blood ran cold. Time manipulation? He had heard of experiments in theoretical physics, but this? This was something straight out of a science fiction novel. And yet, as he looked at the device, the faint hum of energy emanating from it, he knew it wasn't just some fantasy. This was real. "I'm not part of this," Nate said again, his voice firmer now, even as his pulse quickened. "You can't force me into your plan." Dr. Price didn't even flinch. You misunderstand, Nate. You were never a mere messenger. You were chosen for your ability to adapt, your resilience. You'll help us make history. The gunman, who had been standing in the corner like a shadow, suddenly moved. He walked toward Nate, his steps deliberate, and as he did, Nate instinctively took a step back. No. No way, Nate said, his heart pounding. He had to act now. His body tensed as he searched his surroundings, looking for anything that could help him. His gaze flicked to the door, still ajar, and then back to the gunman, who was now only a few feet away. Nate had no weapon, no backup, but there was one thing he could use: the element of surprise. In one fluid motion, Nate lunged forward, pushing past the gunman and slamming into the desk with the device on it. The sudden force of the impact caused the device to tip over, sending a jolt of electricity through the room. Sparks flew from the machine, and the lights above flickered violently. Dr. Price's eyes widened with shock, but before she could react, Nate darted toward the door. The gunman shouted, his hand reaching for his weapon. But Nate was already through the doorway and running down the hallway, adrenaline surging through his veins. The sounds of pursuit came behind him, footsteps pounding against the cold floor. But Nate didn't stop. He couldn't. He had no idea where he was running, but he couldn't afford to stop now. The stakes were too high. The corridor twisted and turned, endless, the doors to rooms and labs blurring as he passed them. There were no windows, no signs of escape, just a maze of sterile walls and humming machines. He burst through another door, finding himself in what appeared to be a storage room. Boxes stacked high, crates marked with strange codes. For a moment, it seemed like a dead end. But then, he saw it. An old service elevator, tucked into the corner of the room, its steel doors slightly ajar. Without thinking, Nate sprinted toward it. His hand gripped the edge of the door, and with a hard push, he forced it open. Inside, the elevator was small, barely large enough to fit him, but it was his only shot. He jumped in, pressing the button for the ground floor, hoping it was the right one. The elevator lurched to life with a grinding noise, and as the doors slammed shut, Nate could hear the footsteps of the gunman growing closer. His breath was coming in short, ragged gasps now, but he wasn't stopping. Not now. The elevator descended quickly, and the sound of the machinery seemed to fade away, replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of the cables beneath him. He wasn't sure if he'd lost them, but he couldn't afford to look back. He had to keep moving. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, the doors opened, and Nate bolted out, scanning the area quickly. He didn't know where he was, but he was in the clear, for now. But the thought that kept gnawing at him was this: what had they been working on? And what had he just set into motion? The hunt wasn't over, not by a long shot. Nate's feet hit the ground with a heavy thud as he sprinted through the corridor, his body screaming for rest, but his mind screaming louder for escape. His breath was ragged, his heart racing, and every muscle in his body screamed for him to stop. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he had just thrown a wrench into the carefully orchestrated machine of Dr. Price and her team. His thoughts swirled in chaos. What had he just interrupted? That device, it wasn't just a machine. It was something far more dangerous, something they wanted, something they needed. But what was it? Was it really about controlling time, like Dr. Price had said? Or was that just the tip of the iceberg? He didn't know the answers. But one thing was certain. He was in deeper than he had ever imagined, and there was no going back. The building around him seemed to stretch on forever. Endless steel hallways, each turn leading him deeper into the unknown. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted, that every step was being tracked, every move anticipated. But for now, he had the advantage. He rounded a corner, and ahead, he saw a door, marked with the word "Exit" in large, bold letters. His chest tightened, hope surging in his chest. Could this be the way out? As he approached, he slowed down, listening carefully for any sounds of pursuit. There was nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just the hum of the building and the pounding of his own heart. Nate reached the door, his hand trembling as he grabbed the handle. He pushed it open with force, and a sharp pain exploded in his side. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat as he staggered backward, looking down at the dark stains spreading across his shirt. Blood. His blood. The gunman. Nate spun around, his vision blurring for a split second as the gunman stepped out of the shadows. His eyes were cold, devoid of emotion, and the gun in his hand gleamed with a deadly purpose. Nate's hand shot to his side, clutching the wound, but he didn't have time to feel the pain. He had to keep moving. "You thought you could just run," the gunman sneered, his voice low and mocking. "You don't get to escape that easily." Nate's mind raced. The pain in his side was unbearable, but his survival instinct kicked in. He couldn't let this be the end. He couldn't die here, not when there was still so much he didn't understand. "You're not getting away with this." Nate spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. He had no idea how he was going to fight back, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. He wasn't just going to roll over and let them win. The gunman smirked, taking a step closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. Nate's mind was a blur as he stumbled backward, his hand still clutching the wound. His feet hit something solid, a metal crate, and in that moment, he made a decision. Desperation surged through him, and he acted on instinct. He kicked the crate, sending it sliding toward the gunman. The unexpected move caught him off guard, and for just a fraction of a second, the gunman hesitated, his focus broken. That was all Nate needed. He dove toward the gunman, his hands grabbing the nearest object, a broken metal rod lying on the floor. With a grunt of pain, he swung it with all his strength, catching the gunman across the arm. The gun flew out of his hand, clattering to the floor. The gunman staggered back, cursing, and Nate took the opportunity to push past him, sprinting down the hallway. He didn't know how long he could keep this up, but he wasn't going to stop. Not when he was so close. He reached the next corner, his eyes scanning for any sign of escape. His chest burned with every breath, and the blood loss from the wound in his side was starting to make his head spin. But he couldn't afford to stop. Then he saw it, a door just ahead. This one had no exit sign, but it was his only chance. He reached it, slammed it open, and the world seemed to fall away beneath him. He was falling. No, it wasn't just that. He was descending, the ground dropping out from beneath him in a way that defied gravity. He tried to catch himself, but his legs were numb, his body weak from blood loss. Everything around him turned to darkness, and then there was nothing. Nate's world swirled in and out of focus. One moment, everything was spinning, and the next, there was only darkness. The sensation of falling, of tumbling through nothingness, seemed to stretch on for what felt like an eternity. His body felt weightless, but the pull of the world beneath him seemed endless. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest aching with each ragged intake of air. He couldn't focus, couldn't think. His mind was hazy, clouded by pain and the disorienting weightlessness. He knew he had to move, to act, but his body refused to listen. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. He hit the ground with a brutal thud. The impact was jarring, sending a wave of pain through his already battered body. He groaned, pushing himself to his knees, his hands trembling as they scraped against the cold, hard floor beneath him. His side felt like it was on fire, the blood from his wound soaking through his shirt. His vision flickered as he blinked, struggling to regain control over his surroundings. When his vision finally cleared, he realized something shocking. He wasn't in the lab anymore. He wasn't even in the building. He was in a wide, open space, bare, metallic walls surrounding him on all sides, stretching far above. The ground beneath him wasn't concrete or steel. It was something else entirely. It felt soft, almost like a sponge. But there was no time to think about that now. His immediate concern was the fact that he had just fallen, literally fallen, into what appeared to be some sort of strange, isolated chamber. The air was heavy with silence. Nate pushed himself to his feet, clutching his side. His mind raced with questions. Had he been transported somewhere else? Was this part of their twisted experiment? The last thing he remembered was running from the gunman, falling through the doorway. But this was something different, something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Then, as his eyes scanned the area, something caught his attention. A figure, tall, cloaked in shadows, stood at the far end of the chamber, They were motionless, waiting. Nate tensed, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The figure didn't move, just watched him with an unnerving stillness. Was it another agent of Dr. Price? A trap? Or was it something else entirely? "Who are you?" Nate called out, his voice hoarse but demanding. The figure didn't respond at first. Then, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, it finally spoke, its voice low and smooth, almost hypnotic. "You're awake," the figure said. "I didn't think you would be." Nate's stomach churned. He had no idea who or what this was, but it wasn't something he wanted to deal with. He tried to take a step back, but the figure took a step forward, its presence almost suffocating in its intensity. "Why are you here?" Nate demanded, gripping the edge of a nearby crate to steady himself. "You're a part of something far larger than you can comprehend," the figure replied, its words carrying a weight of truth that made Nate's chest tighten. "You've been chosen, Nate. You've been a part of something bigger than a simple courier job from the very beginning." The words hit Nate like a punch to the gut. He wanted to scream at the figure, to demand answers, but there was no strength left in him. His mind was reeling, his body growing weaker by the second from the blood loss. The figure's eyes, Nate had just noticed them, glowed faintly, as if the very essence of this place radiated through them. It didn't look human, at least not in the way Nate understood humans. The creature's face remained obscured, but its voice sent chills down Nate's spine. "Dr. Price is only one part of this," the figure continued, stepping closer. "Her plan, her manipulation of time, it's all part of a larger design. A design that you, Nate, are intricately tied to." Nate's mind raced, trying to make sense of what the figure was saying. He had heard Dr. Price talk about time manipulation, about changing the course of events. But now, it sounded like there was something even deeper at play, something far more dangerous. "I don't understand," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible as the exhaustion and blood loss began to take their toll. He fell to one knee, the world around him starting to spin again. The figure was standing before him now, its presence overwhelming. "You will soon," it said softly. "But first, you need to survive." Nate's vision blurred, his breath shallow. As the figure knelt beside him, he felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over him, despite the dire circumstances. His head drooped, and for a moment, he allowed himself to give in to the darkness that beckoned him. But as he slipped into unconsciousness, one thought remained. What had he become a part of? Nate's mind floated in and out of consciousness, the world around him slipping in and out of focus like a distant dream. He wasn't sure how long he had been unconscious. Minutes? Hours? Time no longer seemed to follow any logical pattern. The only thing he was sure of was the strange calm that had settled over him, the quiet voice of the figure echoing in his mind. "You need to survive." But what did that even mean? When Nate finally regained full awareness, he found himself no longer on the cold, metallic floor of the chamber, but on a bed. His side, the wound, felt numb, unnaturally so. And his body, though weak, was no longer in the agonizing pain it had been moments before. He shifted, trying to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they weren't quite his own. His eyes opened fully, and he found himself staring at a sterile white room. The walls were smooth, unbroken by windows or doors, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. There was a faint hum in the background, like a distant engine powering something far away. And standing at the foot of the bed was the figure. It had changed position since the last time Nate had seen it. Now, the figure seemed to loom over him, still obscured, but this time its face was visible, or at least something resembling a face. It wasn't fully human, but it had a certain familiarity to it. The eyes. They glowed faintly, not with a natural light, but with a soft, almost unnatural energy that seemed to pulse in time with Nate's own heartbeat. Its expression was unreadable, like a mask too perfect to show any emotion. "You're awake," the figure said once again, its voice calm and almost comforting, as if it were a caretaker watching over a child. Nate's breath caught in his throat. He was alive. But how? He had been sure, certain, that he was done for. His mind scrambled for answers, and the question he had to ask came tumbling out before he could stop it. "What are you?" Nate's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but the question had to be asked. The figure seemed to consider this for a moment, its glowing eyes narrowing as though it was weighing how much to reveal. Finally, it spoke. "I am something you would not understand, not yet, but soon you will. You've already seen too much, Nate. You're part of something much bigger now." It paused, almost as if savoring the moment. "You were always going to be part of it. There is no going back." Nate's head swam with the implications of the words, but his body felt like it was drifting in a fog. There was so much happening. So much he still didn't know. And yet, here he was, in this strange room, with no idea what was coming next. "Dr. Price," Nate rasped, his throat dry. "What is she? What does she want with me?" The figure moved closer to the bed, its form shifting almost like smoke in the air. It hovered there for a moment, silent, before answering. "Dr. Price is but a piece of a much larger puzzle. She is human, and yet she believes she can control forces far beyond her understanding. Time manipulation is only the beginning. But even she is not aware of what truly drives this project. You, Nate, you are the key to unlocking it all. You will understand soon enough." Nate's heart raced in his chest. Time manipulation? Was that what this was all about? But there had to be more to it. He was the key. That didn't make any sense. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the weight of his exhaustion was too great. His eyelids grew heavy, and his head felt like it was being pulled under a tide, as if the darkness itself was calling him to surrender. "Sleep," the figure said softly, its voice laced with something like pity. "You will need your strength. There is much to do, and the next part of the plan begins soon." Nate wanted to fight it. He wanted to stay awake, to keep pushing for answers, but he couldn't. His body betrayed him. As he slipped back into unconsciousness, one thought remained. There was no escaping this. The sensation of waking up was strange, like breaking through the surface of deep water. The oppressive weight of unconsciousness lifted slowly, and Nate found himself blinking in the dim light of the sterile room once more. His body felt lighter, as if the pain from his side, the exhaustion, the fear, it had all been muted, suppressed. His limbs were still heavy, but there was a new clarity to his thoughts. He sat up slowly, taking in the room around him with cautious eyes. The walls were still blank, still unyielding. No windows, no doors. The humming sound from before was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. He wasn't sure how much time had passed since the figure had put him to sleep, but the more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. There was no sign of the figure, no one around him. Just him and the stark, cold emptiness of the room. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it all. The strange, cloaked figure, the cryptic words, but the faint pulsing light in his vision, the memories of what it had, said they were all too vivid to ignore. He had to get out. He didn't know what this place was, but it wasn't where he belonged. He had to keep moving. He needed to know more. His mind demanded answers. Nate swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his side flared with a dull ache. The blood loss was still there, lurking, but it was no longer overwhelming. He was alive, surprisingly so, but that didn't mean he was safe. He stood shakily, taking a deep breath as he forced his body to respond. The room felt off, like it was alive in some way. A strange energy hummed beneath the surface, and it only made him more certain that his escape was vital. The weight of the place, whatever it was, pressed against him, urging him to stay still, to not question things. But Nate refused. He had to find a way out. His eyes darted around the room. The walls were bare, smooth, nothing to grab onto. But, as he moved closer to one corner, he saw something strange, a faint crack in the wall, barely visible unless one knew where to look. It was almost as if the wall was trying to hide it. But there it was. A crack, just large enough to be a weakness. Approached it cautiously, running his fingers along the edge. It was solid, unyielding, until he pressed a little harder, and suddenly, A panel slid open silently, revealing a narrow passageway hidden behind it. Nate's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea where it led, but there was no time to second guess. He stepped through the opening, the cool air of the tunnel wrapping around him. The passage was tight, narrow, with dim lighting illuminating only a few steps ahead of him. The walls here were different, more organic, almost pulsing with energy. His breath caught in his throat. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in sync with his movements. He continued forward, his steps echoing faintly in the narrow space. He had no idea what he was walking into. He didn't know where this tunnel would take him, but his instincts told him that it was better to move than to stay put. Every footstep was a reminder that he couldn't trust anyone or anything. Not Dr. Price, not the figure, not even his own instincts. They had all led him here, to this strange place, this uncertainty. And then he heard it. A sound, faint at first, growing louder with each passing second. It was a soft hum, like machinery coming to life. But it wasn't just machinery. There was something else mixed in. Something alive. Nate's heart pounded in his chest as he quickened his pace. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, its end still hidden in shadows. The humming grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like it was coming from all around him. And then, ahead of him, a door appeared. Not just any door, this one was marked. Etched into the metal was a symbol, an intricate design that seemed almost familiar. Nate's pulse quickened. Had he seen it before? Was this where the answers lay? His fingers grazed the cold surface of the door, and it slid open silently in response to his touch. He stepped inside, his breath held, his heart pounding in his ears. The room was enormous. The walls stretched up into the darkness, disappearing beyond his sight. The center of the room was dominated by a massive pulsing device. Its surface was covered in strange glowing symbols, and tubes of liquid snaked from one side to the other, feeding into it like veins, and there, in front of the machine, was Dr. Price. She stood perfectly still, her back to him, watching the machine as if it were the only thing that mattered. Nate's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment he had feared. She was the one behind it all. You shouldn't have come. Here, Nate. Her voice was cold, without the warmth it had once held. But now that you're here, you'll understand. You'll see the truth. Nate took a step forward, his pulse racing. This was the moment. The answers were within his reach. He had to confront her, to find out everything. But the words he had been searching for caught in his throat. The machine before him, its hum grew louder, almost deafening, shifted, and something else emerged from the shadows. A figure, cloaked in darkness, just like the one who had spoken to him before. Nate's legs felt like lead as he turned to face it, and then everything around him shifted, like the very fabric of reality was bending and warping. It was happening again. The air in the vast room felt thick, suffocating. Nate's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the figures in front of him. Dr. Price standing beside the massive machine, and the cloaked figure from before, now stepping forward like some dark sentinel. The hum of the machine grew louder, filling the room with an almost mechanical heartbeat. The walls seemed to close in, the pulsating lights flickering as if reacting to the energy in the air. Nate's heart thundered in his chest, his breath shallow as he tried to steady himself. Dr. Price turned slowly to face him, her eyes hard, her expression unreadable. There was no warmth in her gaze anymore, only a cold, calculating resolve. "You've made it this far, Nate," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But this is where your journey ends. The truth has already been set into motion. You're too late to stop it." Nate's eyes darted from Dr. Price to the cloaked figure. "What? What is all of this? What do you want from me?" The cloaked figure stepped forward now, its face still obscured by shadows. It spoke in a voice that was both familiar and alien, like a whisper that echoed in the back of his mind. "You are the key, Nate. You've always been the key." A chill ran down Nate's spine. "The key to what?" he demanded, his voice raw. Dr. Price stepped closer, her gaze locking onto him. "To the machine. to the power to control time itself. Nate's stomach twisted. Time manipulation. It was real. All the theories, all the experiments, they weren't just fantasies. This machine, the one they had built, could actually change time. And somehow, he was tied to it. Time itself? Nate whispered, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Dr. Price nodded. This machine, it's capable of bending time, creating alternate realities, rewriting history, shifting the very fabric of the past. But it requires a sacrifice, a tether to the past, something unbreakable. That's where you come in. Nate felt the weight of her words sink in. You're using me as a tether? Not just you, the figure interjected, its voice colder now. You are part of a greater design. Dr. Price may think she controls it, but the machine is not fully in her hands. You will be the one to complete what she started, whether you want to or not. Nate's head spun. His thoughts became a tangled mess of confusion and anger. He had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't understand, a game with stakes that were beyond his comprehension. But now, the truth was undeniable. He had been chosen for something far bigger than himself, something that would reshape everything. He clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. The machine, the cloaked figure, Dr. Price. None of it made sense. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let time itself be controlled like this. Stop, Nate said, his voice firm. I won't be part of this. Dr. Price's lips curled into a thin smile. You don't have a choice. But as she stepped closer, Nate's vision blurred for a moment. He felt the tug of the machine, its energy pulling at him. It was like the very air around him had come alive, swirling with power. His mind flashed, back to the cracked wall in the hidden room, the passageway, the overwhelming feeling that this was all leading to this moment. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let the machine rewrite history. He had to destroy it. But how? The figure spoke again, its voice sharp and commanding. You cannot fight fate, Nate. This has been written in the stars long before you were born. Nate took a step back, his mind whirling. There had to be a way. He wasn't just a pawn, he was human. And humans had the power to change everything, even fate itself. A surge of adrenaline coursed through his body as he looked at the machine once more. He didn't have much time. The cloaked figure was moving closer, and Dr. Price was watching. Him like a hawk, waiting for his next move. But Nate had already made up his mind. He lunged toward the machine, ignoring the pain in his side. His hand reached out, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his body moved without hesitation. He had no plan, no idea what would happen next. He just knew that he had to act. He had to destroy it. The moment his fingers touched the machine, everything exploded. A flash of light so bright it burned into his vision. A deafening roar filled his ears, and the world around him shattered. The blinding light felt like it was tearing through his very soul. Nate's body went rigid, as if frozen in place, while the sound around him became nothing but a deafening roar. He couldn't tell if he was still in the room with Dr. Price and the cloaked figure, or if he had been transported somewhere else entirely. For a split second, time itself seemed to stop. The weight of the machine, the presence of Dr. Price, and the ominous figure, all of it faded into nothingness. But then, just as quickly, everything snapped back. Nate gasped as he stumbled backward, his hand still outstretched toward the machine. His vision blurred as his body was hit with a wave of dizziness. The world around him felt different. The hum of the machine had stopped, replaced with a strange stillness, almost like the air was thick with anticipation. He looked down at his hand, still trembling from the energy he had just unleashed. The machine before him was silent now, but it wasn't destroyed, just dormant. It stood there, massive and imposing, its glowing symbols now dull, as if its power had been temporarily sapped. What have you done? Dr. Price's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. It was sharp, laced with fury and disbelief. She stepped forward, her eyes wild. You've broken it. Nate struggled to focus on her, his body still reeling from the shock of the explosion. His chest heaved. with heavy breaths, and his thoughts raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He hadn't destroyed the machine, but had he disabled it? Had he moved time? The cloaked figure stepped forward, its presence almost suffocating. The darkness around it seemed to stretch, as if the figure itself was an embodiment of the very shadows. "This was always going to happen," it said coldly. "You were never meant to understand. You never could." Nate's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What is this place? What are you?" Dr. Price's laugh was bitter, echoing off the walls. "You were the key. But the truth is, none of us are in control anymore. This," she gestured to the machine. "This was always supposed to happen. You've merely triggered what was already in motion." The cloaked figure's voice, now tinged with something more sinister, continued. "Time has always been a cycle, Nate. It never truly ends. It only loops. The past and future are nothing but illusions. The machine was supposed to bring us closer to understanding that truth. But now you've forced a change." Nate's stomach twisted. "Change? How? What did I do?" "You stopped the flow," Dr. Price said. "You have no idea what you've interrupted." A deep, eerie silence hung in the air. Nate felt the weight of it pressing against him, and the cold realization that something had gone horribly wrong. But something else was nagging at him. What if it wasn't wrong? What if this was the only way? He looked at the machine again. The pulsing light had dimmed, and the strange symbols on its surface had begun to shift. It was still functional, but something about it felt different now. Like the very essence of time had been altered, even if just for a moment. In that moment, Nate knew that he couldn't let Dr. Price or anyone else use this machine again. It was too dangerous, too powerful. "I don't know if I can stop it completely," he said, his voice hoarse, but steady. "But I'm not letting you use it." The cloaked figure tilted its head as if studying him. "You think you can stop fate? This was always meant to happen, Nate. The machine was only the first step. You were never supposed to destroy it. You were supposed to control it. But I'm not going to control it. I'm going to end it," Nate said, his voice unwavering. With that, he turned and sprinted toward the machine again, determined to finish what he had started. His side still throbbed in pain, but he ignored it. Every step, every breath, was a step toward freedom. He wasn't sure how, but he had to stop. This. As he reached the machine, he pressed his hand against it once again. This time, it was different. He didn't know if it was the result of his own will or the machine reacting to his presence, but there was an overwhelming force pulling at him. He felt his body being pulled into the machine, as if it were trying to consume him. Nate gritted. His teeth. He couldn't let it win. His hand glowed with an unfamiliar energy, pulsing in sync with the machine's rhythms. A blinding light enveloped him, and the room around him seemed to warp. His body felt like it was being torn apart and remade, like he was in two places at once, in multiple realities, all blending together in a surreal haze. He thought of the people he loved, of the moments in his life that mattered most. Time, his past, his future. Everything that made him who he was. He focused on it, pulling the memories together, willing the machine to understand. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The light exploded outward, a pulse that felt like it tore through the fabric of space itself. Nate's body jerked, every nerve in his system screaming as if it were being rewritten, remade. The sensation was so intense that it became almost unbearable. An overwhelming pressure inside his head, as if his mind itself were being split apart. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were no longer his own. The room spun around him, the walls distorting and shifting like liquid. Time no longer felt like a steady flow, but a series of fragmented moments. Glimpses of the past, the present, the future, all blending together in a chaotic swirl. Nate was lost, disoriented, unable to tell where he ended and the machine began. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he was dying. The light around him grew brighter, hotter, and the pain in his body intensified, as if he were being torn apart at the molecular level. But then, through the chaos, he heard something. A voice. It was Dr. Price's voice, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from another world. You don't understand, Nate. This is your only chance. You don't get to walk away from this. The words cut off abruptly, swallowed by the sound of the machine's energy surging to a deafening crescendo. Nate's mind screamed for release, but his body was no longer in his control. The machine was in control now, drawing from him, using him, until there was nothing left but the pulse of the energy coursing through his veins. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light faded. Nate collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body trembling, his vision blurred, his senses still reeling from the immense power that had just coursed through him. Slowly, the world around him began to come back into focus. The distortion began to fade, the walls and the machine returning to their proper shape. But something had changed. Nate wasn't sure what, but he could feel it in his bones. The air felt different. The weight of time had shifted. He staggered to his feet, wiping his face with trembling hands. He could see Dr. Price and the cloaked figure in the distance, their silhouettes now less imposing, more distant. It was as if they too had been affected by the surge. But something was wrong. The feeling in the room wasn't just unsettling, it was unnatural. The air felt heavy with a presence that was not supposed to be there. Did you feel that? Nate whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. The very fabric of reality had been strained, stretched thin, and it felt like something was on the edge of snapping. But then, a voice, one that wasn't Dr. Price or the cloaked figure, echoed in his mind. Time has already begun to shift. Nate spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The words weren't his thoughts. They were an external force, something far beyond him. It felt like a presence, something ancient and vast, the force that had driven the machine in the first place. The voice spoke again, this time clearer, sharper, and with an authority that sent a chill down Nate's spine. You've triggered something. You don't understand, Nate. The machine is merely a tool. You were the key to unlocking what lay beyond. Nate's mind raced. Who are you? He demanded, his voice shaking. What is this? What have I done? The presence didn't answer, but a feeling of overwhelming weight settled over Nate, like the entire world had shifted on its axis. He had altered something massive, and there was no going back. He turned to face Dr. Price and the cloaked figure. They were both staring at him, expressions unreadable. Dr. Price's lips trembled, her usual composure crumbling as she saw the change in him. What did you do, Nate? She whispered. There was no anger in her voice now, only a quiet, terrified realization. She knew deep down that this was no longer just about the machine. It was about something far bigger, and Nate was at the center of it all. Nate swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but the weight of what had just occurred hung over him like a storm cloud. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to stop it. But Dr. Price shook her head. You can't stop it now. It's already in motion. You've changed the very course of time itself, and we're all trapped in it. The cloaked figure stepped forward now, its voice low and chilling. Time cannot be undone, Nate. Once the threads are altered, they cannot be rewound. The consequences are already unfolding. Nate's heart raced in his chest. He didn't understand. He didn't know how to undo what he had done. The power of the machine was still pulsing faintly, and he could feel the resonance of its force within him. But the world was different. Time itself felt fragile, as if the slightest disruption could shatter it completely. Suddenly, a low rumble filled the room. The ground beneath Nate's feet trembled, the walls cracking and splintering. The machine before him began to pulse violently, its energy surging and thrashing like a living thing. This is it, Dr. Price said, her voice hollow. The end of everything.